on YouTube.
Okay, well, welcome everybody to this Budget and Financial Strategy Committee meeting. I think firstly, just let's add our congratulations to Martin for being the 151 officer for the unitary. I'm sure we now know that the finances will be in safe hands.
Thank you very much, Chairman.
Okay, right, apologies for absence.
We have apologies for Councillor Rosie Herring.
Okay, thank you. Declarations of interest? No interest, fine. Appointment of Vice Chairman for the remainder of this year. I would like to propose Carol Billingham. Is anybody, and Tony, your second, thank you. Any other nominations? Okay, I therefore declare that Carol is elected Vice Chairman, and I possibly should have asked you whether you were willing to stand first, but I will make that assumption.
Thank you, Chairman. It's the easiest job I've ever done because I've never had to do anything. You're an ever-present, so I have every confidence in taking on the role. Thank you.
Thank you. Right, next item is the minutes from the last meeting. Any comments or issues on that? No? Is it your wish I should sign them?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Agreed.
Thank you. In due course, I will sign them. Urgent business, I have none. Now, next item is the Finance Monitoring Report, and you will have noticed that then this is followed closely by the Quarterly Performance Risk and Finance Monitoring Report. Now, since the Finance Report is within the Quarterly Performance Risk and Finance Monitoring Report, and the appendices relating to the Finance Report are contained in item 8 rather than item 7. Can I take these together and we will just look at the quarterly report as one item? Is that okay with everyone? Okay, right, thank you for that. So over to you, Martin.
Okay, thank you, Chairman. And I'll concentrate on the finances as part of presenting this particular report. So I think the first point for me to make is that this was the position at the end of the first quarter, so it's the position at the end of June, and obviously things have moved on a bit since then. We always have this dilemma about the running of meetings when reports go into meetings, so we always take the report for the first quarter to the first relevant meeting after that first quarter ends, which in this case was the Audit Committee, I think. Then it went on to Cabinet, and then it comes here because this is the next meeting available and we don't have the second quarter figures yet. So these are a couple of months out of date, but I will update you in terms of what the current position is, because we've got the position at the end of August. So I'll just make you aware verbally of what the situation there is. So at the end of the first quarter, at the end of June 2020, the overall position on the finance of the authority was £536,000 overspend. Now, I hasten to add that a lot of that was in relation to the pressures we were facing as a result of COVID-19. So within that figure, there was gross COVID pressures of £2.346 million. And offsetting some of that was £1.2 million worth of COVID grant funding we'd received from the government. A decision was also taken earlier in the year that we would actually we had an underspend for 2019-2020 that equated to £530,000, and we said we would bring that into this year to offset any COVID pressures that we're aware of, because obviously COVID pressures started becoming apparent around about March last year. So the decision was taken that the underspend from last year would be carried forward into this year and would help offset some of those pressures. So it does take into account the government grant fund of 1.2 million. It does take into account the 530,000 we brought from last year, brought forward from last year, and the net position at the end of the first quarter was that 536,000. There is lots of detail contained within the quarterly reports, the quarterly performance monitoring and risk report, which sets out how that £536,000 is made up. However, the other important point that I want to mention is we do know that we expect to get some fees and charges compensation. We've had the guidance on that from the government. That talks about if a local authority has suffered a loss in fees and charges, we have to withstand the first 5% of that. But on a list of fees and charges they've given us details on, they will then pick up the 75% of the additional loss of those fees and charges. We're working through that detail at the moment, and we expect we'll claim that grant, of course, and we're doing returns to make sure that we do reclaim that grant. This figure of 536,000 doesn't take into account that additional compensation, and we expect that additional compensation to be between 300,000 and 400,000 at this point in time. So it's going to largely offset the deficit that you've got here. But as I say, we're working through that detail at the moment. So I'm not going to say that's a concrete figure I've just given you there. It's an indication of the magnitude of what we think it might be in terms of additional income coming through to offset those pressures for this year. I will then jump actually to the latest position, because that was the position at the end of the first quarter. And there's been a couple of movements in between the months of July and August. So the position at the end of August is 552,000 overspend is now being forecast for the rest of the year. So it hasn't moved significantly since that end of first quarter position of 536,000. It's gone up slightly. I think in the intervening months, so we monitor on a monthly basis, we consider that internally, we report on a quarterly basis. So the figure for July went up a bit, and now it's come down a bit again for the August position, and is not considerably different from the position at the end of June. Again, that 552,000 doesn't take into account any fees and charges compensation, which we expect to claim. So we expect that to offset the majority of that pressure at this point in time. The other thing that's worth highlighting is that, of course, we don't know what's going to happen in relation to COVID-19 going forward. If there is going to be a second spike, what the impact of that will be on the finances, what the impact on that will be in terms of further government funding coming to help us offset some of those pressures going forward. So what we're in the process of doing, and this will be contained in the second quarter's report, so the position at the end of September, is we will do a worst case scenario, a likely scenario, which would be this one, and then a worst case scenario. So let's say there was a second spike, there was significant loss of fees and charges as a result, there was a significant increase in costs as a result, and assuming we didn't get any further government support, we'll present that as the worst case scenario, so you're aware of that. But we'll also present the central theme, which is this thing we've got here. So you'll get those two different scenarios coming forward to a future meeting for your consideration. So in summary, I think they're the main points that I wanted to highlight. I won't go through all the detail that's contained in the actual detailed report, which followed on from this agenda item. I'll pause there for any questions, Chair.
Tony, so you first, yeah. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
Right, okay. Tony.
Martin, you probably took the wind out of myself slightly, because you preempted part of the question relating to the worst case. But let's assume that maybe the worst case is $1 million as opposed to 500,000. What would we do about recovering the 1 million-ish?
Okay, so we would a number of things we would do. So if we had a worst case scenario, we'd need to start preparing for that. We'd need to see if there was any areas of expenditure we think we could restrict going forward between now and the end of the year to try and offset that as much as possible and mitigate that as much as possible. We would, I won't go as far as say expect, but we would hope that we would get further government funding and further support to help to offset that. But I think if none of that came to pass, we would have to fall back on our general fund balances. You know, that's the ultimate contingency of last resort that we have. So if we can't reduce costs elsewhere to offset that additional pressure, if we don't get additional funding coming from the government, we would fall back on reserves and balances. They are there for situations like this, for emergency situations, and we may have to use them in a situation like this. In terms of our level of general fund balances, they're significant. So at the moment, we've got about £2 million in general fund balances, and we've also got a number of earmarked reserves, some for risk, and therefore you could have a look at those and potentially unearmark those and use those as well. So it isn't ideal having to do that, but that would be our fallback position.
We are covered for the rainy day.
We are
Excellent.
covered for the rainy day, yeah.
Yeah, and there do seem to be a number of councils that are, significantly worried about their financial position going forward, and are contacting the government to, get extra support. But I think most of those are in the sort of county arena, where the amounts that they are short are in many millions rather than hundreds of thousands. I think as far as we're concerned, at this stage we're okay. We can put in place plans to minimise that loss, and hopefully should cover it.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
No.
Ken?
Thank you. Martin, I think most of the questions that I was going to ask have actually been satisfied, but just to confirm that any overspend that we have, if we cannot, should we say, recoup it from the government, presumably that has to come from our reserves.
That's right. Through you, Chair, that's absolutely right. It would need to come from our reserves if we can't actually bring in management actions ourselves to bring the budget back into balance.
With regards to our reserves, what sort of how are our reserves at the moment? So
our reserves at the moment are okay. So and I'll just talk about the general fund balance, because the general fund balance is the contingency of last resort that I've just talked about, and in general fund balances we've got approximately £2 million sitting in there. We also have a number of earmarked reserves that I've talked about as well, which if we wanted to, if we needed to, we could unearmark some of those and transfer them into general fund balances. But I think that the figure I'll quote for this meeting is 2 million in general fund balances.
Yeah. Just with regards to my ignorance, the term of general fund balances, what does that really mean?
It means, okay, so it's the funds that we have set to one side, which aren't allocated for any specific purpose. They're held as effectively as your final contingency. So if there is an emergency, you can use them for that. You need to have a sufficient level of general fund balances to underpin the budget and the budget plans that you've got. And we feel at £2 million we've got a sufficient level of general fund balances, but essentially it's the money set to one side that can be used for emergency situations like this.
Thank you for explaining that, Martin. That's been very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Carol, I think you had a question.
Thank you, Chairman. Two comments. Well, one's a comment, one's a question. I'm going to make my annual comment about the delay in members of the Budget and Finance Strategy Committee receiving this report, because it is June. We are nearly at the end of September. We did agree about 6 months ago, or a bit longer possibly, when Martin rejoined us, that we were going to have quarterly reports, because we'd started to have some monthly ones that were a bit over the top, I think. However, I do feel that the members of this committee are somewhat left out of the loop, because this is, 83 days old. And whilst I acknowledge that the July meeting, which was cancelled for lack of business, was perhaps a little on the early side, I think that we could have employed a few more brain cells to get a meeting before now. We tend not to have meetings in August because people go on holiday, but in reality, we don't tend to go on holiday that much in August anymore. And certainly with virtual meetings, I think we could have had something, and hopefully the same thing will not happen with ensuing quarters, and the meetings will be better timed. That's my little rant out of the way. But I know Martin would have been disappointed if I didn't say it. And those of you who've known me on this committee for a long time will know that it's not the first time I've raised this. It is a perennial problem in terms of finance. I know we haven't got a budget to set anymore. I know that our financial strategy is set until the end of this council. However, COVID has brought on different things that have invade upon the workings of the council, and I just think as a committee it would have been nice if we'd been in that loop a little sooner. So that's that done with. I'll say no more on that one. But I wonder if, going back to the COVID funding, you can give us any indication, Martin, of any fraudulent cases of grant funding or applications for assistance. Do we have any figures, and do we have any, in terms of numbers of problems and or of amounts, and any success in retrieving and recovering, please?
Okay, yeah, through you, Chair, and conscious of the fact that we're in a public session here, so I won't go into lots of detail.
No, I wasn't asking for names and addresses.
Yeah, so
really an in principle statement that there may have been some and that they are being addressed would be sufficient, I think, probably. Thank you.
Yeah. So in terms of the grant process that we had, and there was a bit of pressure to rush the grants out as soon as possible. We received £17 million as a cash lump sum, and the expectation was to get that out as quickly as we could. What we chose to do was take a bit of time and actually come up with a robust process. So we did lots of those checks up front. We didn't just push the money straight out to businesses and to those where we had bank account details already. We chose not to do that. We chose to design a proper process. We included corporate fraud as a central player in that process to help us come with a robust approach. We received all of the applications through a web form. We did some initial checks. We used the government's Spotlight fraud detection tool as part of that process. And right at the outset, before we made payments, we sought to minimise the amount of fraud that there could be as part of this overall process. And that seems to have worked quite well. I can't say for certain there wasn't any fraudulent claims. I wouldn't be able to do that. I do know that we have detected some. If there was any concern about any of the applications that came in, they then were pulled out and they were referred directly to our corporate fraud team, who did some further, I guess, more intrusive checks on those particular applications. And they then came back with a recommendation either to me or to my deputy Denise in terms of whether we should make payment to them or not. And so therefore we would have, in some cases, a final view on whether a payment should be made. So I think there were potentially either some errors in the applications or some fraudulent applications, and as a result of that, some payments weren't made. So we stopped a lot of payments being made as a result of that. We are aware of some where a fraudulent claim was put in, and again, we caught it and we didn't make the payment on them. So I guess my comment to the committee is, I think we took the right approach, which was let's not rush this money out as quickly as we can. Let's make sure we design a proper and robust process. And I hope, and I'm touching wood and crossing fingers, that as a result of that we minimise fraud, but we can't say for certain at this point in time.
But there's sort of nothing we're aware of at present where we made a payment and it subsequently turned out to be a fraud. Is that right, Martin?
Yes, that's right. Yep.
Yeah. So that's good. And Martin sent me through this morning. There's another set of payments that the council will be responsible for administering, which will go. Possibly doesn't apply to us at the moment because it's only for areas in lockdown. But where businesses can't open in an area of lockdown, they will be entitled to, I think it's £1,000 if under 51,000 rateable value, or 1,500 for over 51,000, and that will be payable every 3 weeks whilst the lockdown occurs. And there's another one for £500 to individuals who can't work because they're self-isolating, both of which we will have to administer, and work is now underway to develop the processes for distributing those. So,
Thank you.
A busy year. Right. Anybody else got any questions? Chris?
Thank you, Chair. It's not really a question. It's just to reassure members that the Audit Committee did go into some depth into the COVID payments. So if members do want more information, we want to perhaps have a look at the minutes from Audit Committee when they're published.
Okay, thank you for that. Good. Okay, so for items 7 and 8, are we happy to note the contents of the report? Okay, fine. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, I will now move on to the item 9, West Northants unitary budget process. I think Martin again.
Yeah, okay, thank you, Chair. I think my first comment would be there's an awful lot of information in here, and it's on some quite complicated matters. I think it's fair to say that we'll come on to task and finish groups in a few minutes' time, but the way that it's being managed within the overall programme for LGR, it's being managed through a number of task and finish groups, and I'll set out what they particularly will do. When we come to something like council tax harmonisation and council tax reduction scheme, I think it took us probably 5 or 6 meetings to get through all of the detail associated with the recommendations that those particular task and finish groups came to. So I'm conscious of the fact that we've got one item here which is looking at covering 3 of those task and finish groups. So I will give you the kind of summarised version, very much summarised version of that. If people want more information, then happy to do that separately. But I think let's see how we get on. I think the point I'm making is it's a complicated matter, and it can take quite a bit of time to go through all of the detail. But I will kick off. The first point I wanted to highlight was under paragraph 2.2. So the way that the budget process is forming for West Northamptonshire is through a number of task and finish groups that have been set up. There are 3 that are relevant to setting the budget. The first one is the disaggregation task and finish group. The second one is the council tax harmonisation and council tax reduction scheme task and finish group. And the third one is actually the budget and the medium-term financial planning task and finish group. The budget and medium-term financial planning task and finish group couldn't start its work until the work from the disaggregation task and finish group and the council tax harmonisation task and finish group had finished. So I'll start with disaggregation first of all. Under 3.1 of the report, you've got a bit of detail in terms of what the purpose of the group is. You've got the members who were on that group, so who chaired it and deputy chaired it and other members involved. You've got the key activities that they were looking at under paragraph 3.1.4. And then under 3.1.6, you've got the meetings that they held and the main issues that they talked about. The purpose of this task and finish group was really to disaggregate the county council's current budget. So to look at the revenue budget from the county council and to, rather than have a county-wide approach to services, looking at how you disaggregate that between West and North. And then as a result of that, how you disaggregate, so you disaggregate the services, and as a result of that, how you disaggregate, therefore, how you would disaggregate the budget for this year if you were recasting the budget for this current financial year. And so it's to do that for the revenue budget, it was to do that for the capital programme, and for the balance sheet. The approach that it took was to try and agree at the outset a number of principles of disaggregation, and those principles were agreed, and then the budget, the capital programme, the balance sheet was split on those principles. That then would provide a starting point for the revenue budget, because if you've disaggregated the budget, the county council's budget for 2021, that then gives you a starting position for the budget for West Northamptonshire and for North Northamptonshire for 21-22, because we always start with the current year's budget and then we build on that, so we can see that continuity. That's how we always build the budget. What had to happen as well in the final meeting was, once that disaggregation piece of work had taken place, so the principles were agreed, the budgets were disaggregated, and we had an idea of what those figures were, we then had to add to that the budgets from Northampton Borough, from Daventry, and from South Northants, and that's called aggregation. And when we've got that disaggregated county council position and you add in the aggregated position from the districts and the boroughs, you've got a starting position in terms of considering the budget for 21-22. So that's the approach that's the approach the disaggregation task and finish group took. And 3.1.10 in paragraph 3.1.10 just summarizes that really and sets out where it ended up. The output from that particular task and finish group then fed into the budget and medium-term financial planning group. So I'll pause at that point in case there's any questions about disaggregation before I move on to council tax harmonisation and council tax reduction.
Carol?
Thank you, Chairman. I don't want to sound parochial on this one, but I was at a meeting where it was quite evident that a lot of the items, the activities, the organisations that are funded by Northampton Borough Council or underwritten by Northampton Borough Council are very Northampton centric, and that when you have a unitary authority, there is no way that parts of South Northamptonshire like Deanshanger or Chipping Warden or parts of Daventry District Council out on the Leicestershire borders would benefit from them. And I'm sure that's not all. I'm sure there are things in South Northamptonshire that are a bit South Northamptonshire centric, and likewise in Daventry. Is there any way that those activities, those costs, can be devolved or will be devolved, or is there an intention to try and devolve them to town and parish councils within the relevant area so that they are funded by the people who benefit from them and not funded by the whole of the unitary? Or is that too difficult to comprehend, or am I being too petty?
And through you, Chair, I think there are moves afoot to set up a Northampton Town Council, to provide that dedicated level of service. And it's not clear what services they will run, and I wouldn't be able to comment on that at this point in time. But obviously that thought process has taken place, because there are moves afoot to set up not just Northampton Town Council but the parish councils as well across the west of Northamptonshire to do something similar to what you described there, Councillor Billingham.
Thank you.
Right. Anything more on that at the moment?
Yep.
Ken?
Yep. I'll just make sure. Yeah. With regards to, let me see, 3.1.7, a full list of principles is available. Is that incredibly extensive, or is it easy to read, or could we have a copy of those principles?
It's quite extensive. I think you could have a copy, so I could make that available to members of the committee, and it will give you an idea of the types of things that were looked at in terms of splitting those services. And some of them would be obvious. So, for example, how are you going to split the highway service and therefore the highways budget? Well, it should be number of miles of road in the west and number of miles of road in the north. So most of, or all of them, have a sound rationale behind why we come to the conclusion that those principles should be used. But that information is available, and I'd be able to circulate it to you.
Thank you very much, Martin.
Okay, Carol, again.
Sorry, Chairman. I'm not sure if I drifted. I've had a bit of a difficult day today, so I apologise if I missed something that was already said. But what happens to things that are situated in one of the two unitaries that previously, where you can't sort of share out the budget? So highways was a very good example where you can reach a suitable decision because it's very easy. Well, it's not really easy to count the miles of roads, but it's a science rather than an art. What happens to something like Chester Farm, which is very much set now in Northamptonshire, but is an asset for the whole county? And will they bill West Northamptonshire for part of the cost, or will it all devolve onto North because it's in North, and then something else we should get tit for tat in the West, or how has that been sorted out?
Yeah, and there will be some of that. So there will be some areas like Chester Farm which will land in either North or West, but there are some services run out of Chester Farm. So I understand the archive services run out of Chester Farm, and that's a county-wide service. So you would expect a charge to be made to the other authority in terms of the services they're receiving from that particular service, which just happens to be based in Chester Farm. So I think there will have to be some cross-charging between West and North, depending on the services that are run out of the particular geographies where services are, are based, if you like. But yeah, so that's the approach that will be taken. It will be either West or North, but there could be charges going to the other authorities, depending on what services are run from there.
Okay.
It's, Peter, it's Ken again. Sorry,
Ken. Yeah.
Sorry to. Obviously, we've covered a fair amount of how we're going to actually proportion out some of the credits. What happens to debits and that sort of scenario when you look at various of our councils? So what happens to debt?
Yeah. So all of those things were the subject of discussion at the disaggregation group when they looked at the balance sheet. And not every single item could be settled at that point in time. And if I give you an example, within the county council, there is a big pension fund liability, and we would need to, for the opening balance sheet for the two new authorities, we would need to work out, or it would need to be calculated, how much of that liability relates to the West, how much of that liability relates to the North, how much of that liability actually relates to the Children's Trust, for example, that's being set up. You would need to get an actuary involved in doing that calculation. So there are some elements that haven't been finalised at this point of time, because we would need to instruct somebody to come in and do that very professional piece of work to give us a figure to say the liabilities for the West is this amount, the liabilities for the North is this amount, and at that point we will we'll disaggregate those particular areas of the balance sheet. Debt is another good example. And we are commissioning a piece of work to have a look at how that should be split for us to consider, because that hasn't been finalised at this point of time.
Thank you, Martin.
Okay. Right, okay, we're happy with that bit now. So Martin, do you want to go on to council tax harmonisation?
Okay, so if I go on, yeah, thank you, Chair. I'll go on to council tax harmonisation. So the issue here is that across West Northamptonshire there will be 3 different amounts of council tax being charged, and they're set out in paragraph 3.2.4 in the report. So Daventry at the moment, if you look at the amount that's charged for the county council and for the district, it's 1451.56. If you look at the amount that's charged in Northampton Borough, it's 1516.26, and for South Northampton in our area, it's 1481.75. We have by year 8, so over the first 7 years of the new organisation, all of the areas have to be paying the same amount of council tax for those services. So we have to harmonise council tax. There are 2 approaches that can be used for that. So I'm going over the page now, and under 3.2.7, the 2 types of approach are highlighted. So you can either take the average council tax approach, where you work out what the average council tax for the west of Northamptonshire is, and you harmonise to that, or you can take the individual area council tax approach, which is that second bullet point there, and that's where you look at the current amount that's levied in the individual areas, and you limit the increases to the referendum limit for each of those individual areas. But again, you have to harmonise over those 7 years or by the start of year 8. There is a clear financial advantage in taking the first approach, the average council tax approach, and based on the modelling that was carried out, 3.2.8 highlights that by the time you get to year 8, there will be a difference of 7.67 million in those 2 approaches. So 7.67 million pounds more would be generated through the average council tax approach, and if you calculate the cumulative effect of that over those 7 years, the difference between the 2 approaches would be between 32 million and 54 million over that time period, and based on other assumptions that flow through the financial modelling that took place as a result of that. So the view of the Task and Finish group on that particular issue is set out at 3.2.9, and a recommendation was made up to Shadow Executive that the average council tax approach is adopted. So once that's been determined, and that final decision hasn't been taken yet, because that will be part of the budget setting process. But the recommendation from the Task and Finish group is that the average council tax approach is taken. You then need to start thinking about the harmonisation period. So how long are you going to take to actually harmonise the rates? And actually, if you take the average council tax approach in terms of the overall, let's call it council tax yield that you get, it doesn't matter when you harmonise. It makes no difference to the money, because you're taking the average approach rather than the individual area approach. So regardless of whether you actually harmonise in year 1 or you harmonise in year 7, the amount of council tax yield you receive from taking the average council tax approach is the same. So there's no benefit or disbenefit in going for year 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 or 7 from a financial point of view. That's not the case if you take the individual area council tax approach. So that does make a difference on the amount of total council tax yield that you receive, depending on when you actually harmonise. But because the recommendation was to go for the average council tax approach, the timing of that harmonisation period from a financial point of view becomes irrelevant. It becomes very relevant for other reasons, but from a financial point of view, it becomes relevant. So again, I'll pause there, Chair, see if there's any questions on council tax harmonisation before I move on to CTRS.
Yeah, Chris.
Again, Chair, it's more a statement rather than a question, because the decision to go for the average council tax approach wasn't unanimous. And in fact, I pushed for the other option. And the reason being that because the recommendation is to go for the average council tax, it does mean that for residents in South Northants, they will see a rise above the government capping level, because their council tax will have to rise to the level of that in Northampton Borough. And as a result, they will see increases above what they would have seen had we remained as South Northamptonshire Council. But at the end of the day, the majority decision was to go for the average council tax approach, as Martin says.
The rise in South Northamptonshire would not be as much as it would be in Daventry, though, under that approach.
No, that's true. I think Daventry's, they're looking, well, it depends how long you take to harmonise, but Daventry's could be in the region of 6 to 7% increase, whereas South Northants is closer to 5%.
Yeah. Yeah. Martin, did you want to comment on that?
Only to say that those figures quoted by Councillor Lofts are if you harmonise in year 1, but if you harmonised in years 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 or 7, the percentages would be less than those quoted just there. So those figures quoted there were the year if we harmonised in year 1.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Any other questions on this item? Okay, so next bit is council tax reduction scheme.
Okay, so council tax reduction scheme, again, something that you would expect to be harmonised actually by day 1, so by 1st of April 2021. Council tax reduction scheme was a replacement for council tax benefit, and what was brought in was the ability to devise a local scheme to give support to people who had trouble being able to fund all of their council tax, and so therefore there is local discretion in terms of the amount of support given. Up to 100% support could be given, which would be similar to the old council tax benefit scheme, but that generally that level of support generally isn't given across local authorities. What we're interested in is the position across Northamptonshire. So that is set out in 3.2.16, and it shows that for Daventry District Council, they've got what's called a 20% scheme. So council tax payers, working age claimants, and it's means tested. So working age claimants for local council tax reduction scheme within Daventry would have to pay at least 20% of their council tax bill. Working age claimants for LCTRS within Northampton Borough would have to pay at least 31% of their council tax bill, and South Northants would have to pay at least 8.5% of their council tax bill. So quite a difference in terms of the schemes that are currently in place across the west of Northamptonshire, and something else that needs to be harmonised. The more support you give working age claimants, the costlier it is for the authority, and therefore the less support that you give, the less costly it is. So in terms of the cost of those schemes, Northampton Borough scheme at the moment would cost the least. If we move to a 31% scheme across the whole of the west, in the middle then is Daventry's, and then the greatest levels of support is given within South Northamptonshire. So if we move away from the South Northamptonshire scheme, when we get into West Northamptonshire, then residents will get less support than they're currently receiving. If they are working age claimants. There was, again, a huge amount of financial modelling done in terms of what the different costs of the different schemes would be. So if we move to, in the west, a scheme that was similar to Northampton's, what would the savings be? If we move to a scheme that was similar to Daventry's, what would the cost be? If we move to a scheme similar to what's currently in South Northampton, again, what would the cost be? And all of that information was presented into the Task and Finish group. What was also presented was what was called a cost neutral option. So if we looked at the current cost of the current schemes and didn't take into account the additional demand that we're seeing as a result of COVID, because that has an impact as well, what would be the I guess the break even CTRS scheme, and that was worked out to be a 26.5% scheme as set out in 3.2.19. So again, a huge amount of detail which underpinned all of that, and lots of information taken into those Task and Finish groups and considered very carefully. The recommendations coming out of those groups are set out in 3.2.20, 3.221 and 3.222. And the view from the group was the starting assumption for the budget and medium-term financial planning Task and Finish group, which is where again this information goes into, was that the LCTRS scheme should be at least cost neutral compared to the current cost of the scheme. The Task and Finish group requested further information on different collection rates associated with different cohorts of council taxpayer, and that's now being provided to the budget and medium-term financial planning group. And there was more information requested on the timing of the harmonisation of LCTRS. The final point that I just wanted to highlight in this section was under 3.2.24. Whatever scheme you move to, it's treated as a discount on your council tax, and that's relevant because it means if it's treated as a discount, so it's not a benefit, it's a discount that we're giving, that then flows into the tax-based calculation, and the tax-based calculation will have an impact on town and parish councils, and it will have an impact on police, fire and crime commissioner. When we change when we make proposals on the LCTRS, that has to be subject to consultation, and that consultation will be for 6 weeks and is likely to commence in November and run until the middle of December. So there will be full consultation on whatever the options are. But I think again, Chairman, I'll just pause at that point to see if there's any questions. This is quite a complicated area, but if there's any questions, I'm happy to take them.
Okay, Carol?
Thank you, Chairman. I've quickly calculated that on a Band D property at £1,481 a year, somebody who gets benefits from the council tax reduction scheme in South Northamptonshire would pay about £120 instead of £1,481. If we go up to 26.5%, they're going to be paying £380 a year, which is a good £5 a week more to a household that can't afford to pay it anyway. Do we have any thoughts as to how we might help those residents in South Northamptonshire and in Daventry to a lesser degree, who are going to see, I mean, for somebody who hasn't got the money, £5 a week extra is quite a swinging increase, or will they be expected to seek benefits elsewhere?
Through you, Chair, I think that's still got to be determined. You know, I think people are aware there will be impacts on individuals, and in actual fact, the Task and Finish group did ask for detailed information or case study information to go into the group, where they could see what the actual impact on actual individuals would be, and took that into account as well. In terms of Again, it's a recommendation from this group. It's not a final decision. It's subject to consultation. And in terms of any further mitigation for people that are actually affected the most, that's all yet to be determined. So don't have an answer to that tonight at this point in time.
And I think a point on this item is that it has to be harmonised day one by law. We don't have the ability to phase it in, do we?
I think the words in the regulations are it has to be harmonised by day one where practicable.
Right. So
and we think it can be delivered by day one. So strictly speaking, it's where practicable. It has to be delivered by day one.
yeah. I've got another question. Come to you, Tony, in a moment. You talk about the balanced figure of 26.5%. Is that balancing it in the same way as we in South Northamptonshire balanced and said, right, okay, if we give these discounts, then but we still get the money for second homes and homes being renovated, and the various level of discounts that we actually give that sort of contra account against the two schemes. Is that the way you worked out the balance figure?
So the way the balance figure is worked out is we've taken each of the individual schemes at each of the sovereign authorities, and we've said for Northampton, we can see it costs this amount of money for their scheme, for Daventry it's this amount of money, and for South Northampton it's this amount of money. Added all of that together and said what scheme gives us the same quantum of spend going forward. I think one of the other considerations is how do the discounts and exemptions feed into that, and what difference do they make? That is a slightly separate consideration, and I think if we go over the page on 3.2.27, there was a recommendation in there about discounts and exemptions and trying to maximise those to help to offset some of that cost and mitigate it as much as possible.
Yeah. And I think the final point I wanted to make was in terms of our performance in council tax collection in South Northamptonshire, we are far better than Daventry and the borough in collecting the council tax. And you know, if we collect 8%, 8% is, or 8.5% collected is better than 31% not collected. So I think this will be an interesting one. Okay, Tony.
Thank you, Chair. Do I take it from what we've been saying that we are more benevolent than the borough in supporting people?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
And have been for many years.
Because I suspect there's more people in the borough who are in need of support. In general.
Although through you, Chair, that the contrary is also true, that because there are more people, the cost of giving that support is much higher.
Yeah, that is true. And I think we are probably one of the lowest in the country in terms of the amount we expect to pay. And I think the only one that is the same as us is Corby, if I remember rightly.
And that is supported out of the council tax we collect as a total.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions on that bit? So yeah, I think that will be an interesting one, and I would certainly echo Carol's point that it is one area where our residents are going to be hit, or some of our residents are going to be hit particularly hard. Right. Okay. Is it anything else you wanted to do on that, Martin?
Thank you, Chair. Just the final bit then. So once we have the outcomes from those first two groups, the harmonisation group and the disaggregation group, they then feed into the budget and medium-term financial planning task and finish group, and their work has started. So once they receive that initial piece of work from those two other task and finish groups, they could then begin to consider formulating the budget for West Northamptonshire for next year. We are still pulling together a starting position, and we expect to take that into that particular task and finish group in October. And we'll also then have service pressures, impact of COVID, assumptions on CTRS, assumptions on harmonisation, assumptions on government grant, and then we will work through seeking to deliver a balanced budget between that point in time and February, when the budget needs to be set, in a way not dissimilar to the way that SNC have looked at it previously, in terms of having a dedicated budget working group, which is this task and finish group, to consider all of the detail and then make recommendations up at the appropriate point in time. So that process has started already. We expect there to be a deficit to start off with, but we've not actually presented the size of that at this point in time, because we're still working through that level of detail. So that task and finish group will be responsible for making recommendations on delivering a balanced budget for West Northamptonshire for 21-22.
Okay. So when roughly do you think there would be a budget in the public domain for people to consider?
I expect that to be December.
Right. Okay. And then the final decision would be made by the Shadow Council at its October meeting. Is that right?
Final decision would be February meeting.
Yeah, of the Shadow. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Good. Right. So thank you for that, for sharing that. I thought it was important that members of this committee were at least aware and got the chance to ask questions, even though it's sort of outside our control at this stage, but at least we're able to know a bit about what is going on. So thank you very much for that, Martin.
Okay.
Okay. Right. Okay. And then the last item, which I think is down to Jim.
Okay. Thank you, Chairman. This is the regular quarterly update on Section 106 spend to provide oversight of, making sure that we're A, collecting the money we should be, and B, spending it in a timely manner.
Sorry, Jim, can I just pause you a moment and go back to the chairman, please?
Oh,
okay.
Sorry, Chair, are we going to note the recommendations of the task and finish groups
yes.
on
Yeah,
item 9?
Yes, sorry.
Sorry. Sorry to interrupt.
To note the report we just had from Martin. Okay. Yeah, everybody's happy. Thank you. Right. Thank you very much. Jim.
Okay. Yeah, I've started, so I'll finish. Throw back to my youth. Yeah, so there's two data. There should be two data tables. Apologies. The second table doesn't appear to have made it into the agenda pack. It's the same tables that are always presented in these quarterly reports. So the first one summarizes the amount of money that's been secured, the amount of money that's been paid to us, the amount of money that's been spent, and the amount of money that is therefore still available is the first table. And the second table, which is, my apologies once again, appears to be missing from the pack, is the one that sets out when the closest clawback dates are. There's a reminder for the clawback dates. Some planning obligations in Section 106s are time limited. So from the point that we receive the money in our bank account, we have a set amount of time to get that money spent. So it's in our interest to monitor when those clawback dates are, to avoid having to pay the money back to the developers. So there's a couple during the current financial year. They relate to strategic leisure. So they are earmarked and due to be spent. So the first one is December this year, and then the second one is towards the end of March next year for the strategic leisure. And there's another one for public open space, which again is there's proposals by our strategic leisure people to get that money spent. So I'm confident that we're that we're in a good position to avoid having to pay back money to developers for the Section 106s. And I'm also confident that we're in good shape in terms of making sure that we are spending the money on the right things in a timely manner. I can take any questions now, Chairman. I think. Thank you.
Any questions on that?
It's Ken here, Peter. Jim, what's the current situation with the 106 money that is allocated to the NHS?
There was a scrutiny working group that looked at the Section 106s for the NHS and how to improve spending. It's very, very complicated. I believe I've spoken to this committee about this before, where there's two different arms of the NHS that are dealing with the Section 106 money. So there's one that writes a letter that asks us and makes the case and says, this is why we should have money spent on health and here's how much. But it's a different part of the NHS that then is responsible for approving spending on the schemes. And so the scrutiny working group focused on that as an area of work to try and pull it all together. I suppose the short answer to your question is it's still a work in progress and it's something that we're alive to. I would say that it's something that the NHS is also alive to. It's not a problem that's unique to South Northamptonshire, and we're starting to see an approach where there's a bit more of a pragmatism to spend money on nearby schemes if there isn't a scheme that's available within a reasonable amount of time. So we're starting to see money moving around a little bit to actually get things delivered, to get the services delivered. That's partly as a result of the NHS changing how it wants to deliver its services, because of course we secure the money on day one when a planning decision notice is issued. Then there's a number of years that will go by until the triggers hit, and then there'll be another number of years that go by until the NHS is ready to spend it. So during those years that go by between us securing the money on day one and the money actually getting spent on a scheme, then inevitably there's a mini reorganisation, or there's something that changes in the NHS in how they want to spend it. But we do have members of staff in our in the planning department who are focusing very much on making sure that triggers are hit, or making sure that developers are aware that triggers are hit, making sure that the NHS is aware that triggers are hit and that they've got money and what they got the money for.
I think, you know, as I say, in a particular situation with some 106 money at Old Stratford for the health centre there, you know, nearly £100,000 that's been allocated to the improvements at the health centre is actually been sitting in our bank account for nearly 5 years, which seems unbelievable, doesn't it?
It's not ideal. It's pretty far from ideal, I agree. It's not something that we can directly control, unfortunately. So we do everything that we can to nudge it along, but we can't force them to spend it.
As you know, I keep on following up on it, so I'm trying to get it.
Indeed.
But, thank you very much for the advice anyway, Jim. Thank you.
Right. Carol.
Sorry. Thank you, Chairman. I think that health money through Section 106, this is not totally connected to the report, but a fairly general comment, that the health service has never ever got their act together as far as asking for funding from Section 106 agreements unless it's for a specific project. And many times local GPs have complained that education gets such and such and we don't get anything, or we don't get anything near the amount that education are getting. But education have an evidence-based formula which gives them the money per household for X number of primary school pupils and X number of secondary school pupils. The NHS would only need to do those calculations once, and that formula could then be used across the whole of the country. And nobody seems to have had the nous over many, many years to actually get that done and get their act into gear. And I think that whilst that possibly doesn't explain the issue of £100,000 for a specific project in Old Stratford, it does explain why the NHS always feels short, local practitioners, shall we say, always feel shortchanged by what comes out of Section 106 agreements. It's because their higher authority, for want of a better word, that some of their managers can't actually get their act together and work out a formula. Sorry, I'll get off the high horse now.
Thank you for that, Carol. Anybody else? Chris?
Just on a similar vein with the payments to Northamptonshire County Council and being slightly devious, if we were to delay payments to NCC, so they weren't actually paid before next April, and then they were paid to West Northamptonshire, we could at least ensure that they were spent here and not diverted into the north.
I think yeah, it's an interesting point. The money is secured here in South, and I think the intention is that so various pots of money with NCC's name on it. So for highway works, for instance, and for education, and realistically, the problem is going to be in this area that needs the investment spending on it anyway. And so my advice would be, if the education authority says, can we release some Section 106 money to spend on education in the South Northampton area, then I don't see that there's a reason to delay making that payment. So I can see why you would say that in principle, but in practice, the money is secured in the area to be spent in the area to address a specific infrastructure need or requirement in the area.
I was reading the planning white paper, and one of the items in that is suggesting that 106 agreements would go, and they would be replaced by a sort of SIL type thing, a more generalized infrastructure. And then that actually gives you a real problem about keeping the money in the area that takes the development. So my thought would be, if you've got a 106 agreement, it is tied to a particular area. If you have a more centralized infrastructure levy, that would go into West Northamptonshire rather than being for a development in Towcester or Brackley, could be used for anything in Northampton and fund an orbital road or whatever. So that struck me as a rather dangerous item for our residents.
Well, that's a very good point that you've raised, and it gives me the chance to trail the members' seminar next week on the white paper Tuesday afternoon, so we can discuss that then.
Yeah. No, I think it'd be well worth our members attending that. So yes, having read through it, I was thinking, well, before I read through it, I thought, shall I attend? And having read through it, I think I will attend. Right. Thank you for that. Any further questions on 106? Good. Right. Okay. Well, thank you all for attending.
Sorry, can I just ask, Chairman?
Oh, sorry. We'll note that report as well.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, we're all happy with that. Thank you. Right. We can now end the meeting. You want to switch off?